All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. Before we jump in, quick disclaimer. The views expressed by my co-host today are their personal views, and they do not represent the views of any organization with which the co-hosts are associated with. Nothing in the episode is construed or relied upon as financial, technical, tax, legal, or other advice. You know the deal. Now, let's jump into the episode.
All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. This is the first interview episode of Season 5, the endgame for liquid staking. Today, we're going to be joined by Hasu. Hasu is a special guest on Bell Curve at this point. It's a fun callback for those of you who watched the MEV season where Hasu was my co-host. Today, we're going to get him on the other side of the mic talking about one of his other favorite topics outside of MEV, which is liquid staking. Hasu's been acting as a strategic advisor for Lido for a period of time, and not only has great sort of high-level framings on the space for liquid staking, but in this conversation, we got to get into some of the nitty-gritty with him. So in the kickoff episode of this season, Miles and I introduced some of the big themes that we want to get a sense of this season, which is how is the market structure for liquid staking going to develop? What are Hasu's thoughts around the self-limiting debate, which is this idea that if a protocol like Lido gets a very dominant percentage of the market share, should it actually cap itself? We also talked about the impact of restaking and how that intersects in this sort of co-opetition relationship in between protocols like Lido and protocols like Eigenlayer. Now, not only did we get some great high-level frameworks for how we should think about this, and Hasu went deep into the history of Lido and how it developed from a first principle standpoint, we also got into some of the more nitty-gritty sort of tactical ways that these protocols actually develop and think about things. In particular, I want you guys to pay attention to the section where we discuss the role of decentralization and how it actually acts as an offensive tool for protocols like Lido. So this was a really, really great conversation. I hope you guys enjoyed as much as Miles and I did. All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. You got me and my co-host Miles here, and today we're joined by Hasu. It's a special guest, I think, of Bell Curve at this point. Got him back on the other side of the mic. Hasu, welcome back.
Hey, Mike, it's good to be back. It's been a while.
So this is going to be a ton of fun, Hasu. we're going to be, last season we talked about MEV, which is a subject that I know is near and dear to your heart. And then I think we're going to be going down the road here on another subject that's near and dear to your heart, which is liquid staking. So we're recording this on July 6th. We're deep in the heart of a bear market, and it seems like liquid staking is one of the few areas in crypto which is really taking off. As of today, I'm looking at the TVL of Lido, which has just eclipsed 14 billion. That's more than Maker and Aave, the next two largest by TVL on Ethereum combined. So I think we could just start at a high level for this talk and just what is behind the rapid growth and adoption of liquid staking, and then maybe we can get into kind of a state of the union and how to carve out what are the major buckets of different types of providers.
Sure. So I think the reason that liquid staking protocols have risen to the top of the TVL leaderboard, if you will, I think it's in the past, lending markets used to occupy that position because it's a place where people park their assets in order to get some additional rewards on their assets from lending them, for example. But we are seeing in the bear market not very much demand to borrow, and so not very much interest that you can earn from putting your assets into lending markets, frankly. And so that's why I think overall the TVL of lending markets has been on the decline. We are seeing that in MakerDAO in particular. So DAI outstanding has gone down from 10 billion to 4 point something billion. The TVL inside Maker has declined even more. So now a lot more of the DAI outstanding is backed by stable coins or other forms of stable collateral, such as treasury bills that are held in off-chain trusts. And on the other hand, we have seen the rise of proof of stake. So obviously Ethereum went from proof of work to proof of stake, and that allowed users to now secure the network by staking their ETH. We are seeing an increasing demand to participate in that. So for one, users can earn inflation rewards from Ethereum, but they can also earn MEV and transaction fees. And in spite of the bear market, these rewards have actually been quite consistent. much more so than what you can get from lending your coins. The other thing that I would point out is that withdrawals have now been enabled from the beacon chain. So proof of stake in general has been de-risked quite a lot. So my thesis has been for a while that we would see more and more ETH being staked as a result of that, because it's as close to, I don't want to say risk-free because it's not risk-free, but it's as close as it gets basically to the kind of risk-free rate of crypto, which is just staking your ETH, which is kind of the most secure and most decentralized asset, on the protocol layer in order to secure the network. And if you run your own node and you do a good job, or if you delegate that to a staking pool or a staking protocol, then yeah, you generally have that's a pretty good it's a low return, kind of low risk way of using that asset.
One thing I'd be curious to get your perspective on, Hasu, is this sort of recursive leverage trade that people run using a liquid staking token like stETH. So the idea being that, you stake your ETH, you get stETH in return, you turn around to a borrow lending protocol like Aave, you borrow more ETH, and you kind of rinse and repeat, and in that way sort of lever yourself up. I guess there's kind of a spectrum of healthy sort of capital efficiency and wanting to not, lose too much opportunity cost by staking. Maybe that's the really healthy way of doing it. And then you've got this extremely recursive leverage trade that you can run being on the not so healthy way of doing it. So I guess how much of the market is driven by that more degen sort of activity? And where do you sort of fall on the spectrum of, not to, put some sort of value on trading, but is this a particularly good use of liquid staking versus maybe it's excess speculation kind of?
So the first thing that I would say is that this kind of looping is no longer possible today, because you can no longer borrow ETH on lending markets for cheaper than you can stake it for. And that's what you would expect in an efficient market. So there's kind of zero arbitrage anymore. That used to be different in the past, in particular before it was possible to withdraw actually ETH from the beacon chain. And so someone who was holding staked ETH or some other liquid staking token, they were incurring basically like a risk on the price of that moving against their ETH in some form, and they could get liquidated on their position, right? If they were using the liquid staking token as a collateral to borrow ETH, and then the liquid staking token falls in value, then obviously you can be liquidated. And because people were like looping a lot of times, the leverage was very high, and so there was definitely a concern of kind of these cascading liquidations there. You were asking whether this is a useful feature of liquid staking tokens. I mean, I would definitely say so. We can go into how liquid staking is different from other forms of staking in a moment, but the ability for users to get liquidity on their tokens and to use that liquidity for whatever they want is definitely a feature of the system. And likewise, I think it's good for people who put their ETH into lending markets, because as a result of this, the rate of that they could earn on their ETH was driven up to the staking rate, basically, of what they could have earned from staking as well. And so you could say people who are not comfortable maybe staking their ETH, but only putting it in the lending market, so they were participating just the same from the staking yield in that way, which it basically further democratized access to staking through lending markets.
So let's get into, I'd love to get your perspective on what does a state of the union of liquid staking providers look like? And maybe we talked quite a bit about Lido in the first episode actually, but I realized that we never really gave quite an overview of the history of the protocol and how it functions today. And I know you act as a strategic advisor to the protocol, so maybe we could actually start with sort of Lido and get your sense of the overview of maybe wherever you want to start, either the history of the protocol or what you're sort of focused on today. And then maybe we can go and sort of carve out the existing state of the market structure and then try to poke at guesses at how it's going to develop.
Yeah, sure. So small knit, I'm an advisor to the DAO. which is the union of the token holders that basically vote on decisions for what the protocol should do. So Lido, the protocol, was conceived a few years ago, before the beacon chain was even live. And back then, there was only one form of staking, I would say, really known from other blockchains, which is you delegate either you stake yourself or you delegate your coins to a professional node operator. Some blockchains had in-protocol forms of delegation that kind of made it cheaper, more accessible, and also more secure because the node operator didn't have custody of the coins. But Ethereum chose a different route. In particular, they were going with this kind of isolated blockchain that would run in parallel, which was called the beacon chain, right? And that kind of ran its own, you could call it an incentivized testnet for multiple years, before it eventually the proof of work kind of consensus was then stripped out for this beacon chain consensus layer. And that's still how it works. And I would still say this is one of the most impressive technical feats in kind of the history of technology, the way that the engine of this plane was kind of swapped in mid-flight. I still like this analogy very much because it's so fitting. I mean, Ethereum didn't miss any blocks as a result of this, and it's still an absolute technical marvel, the way that this worked. So when it was clear that Ethereum would move to proof of stake, then of course it was obvious that users would want to stake and they would want to participate in securing the protocol. And however, you had several problems in Ethereum. One was in order to run a validator, you needed 32 ETH. That was the minimum at the time. It had already been lowered from, I don't know what the number was before, maybe in a tune of to several hundred ETH. That was when Ethereum was cheaper still, much cheaper than it is today. And they lowered it to 32 ETH. But even at the time, when the beacon chain came out, that was maybe $60,000 or something. So it was a very substantial amount, and not many people had. So needing to stake in increments of 32 ETH was one big problem. The second big problem was that people had to lock up their stake on the beacon chain, and the beacon chain was expected to run for at least 2 to 3 years, maybe longer, before withdrawals would eventually be enabled. And as we saw, that estimate turned out to be pretty accurate. So I think it took around 3 years between launch of the beacon chain and withdrawals going live. So I'm not 100% sure. But it was also clear that people would want liquidity on their stake. So either two outcomes: either people could not get liquidity, and then the number of people who would be willing to stake would be much smaller. Basically, only people who would be comfortable locking up their ETH for many years with an uncertain outcome, if they will ever get it back. Or people can receive, we sometimes call it a voucher, for that represents this ETH that they stake on the beacon chain, and then they can find another they can find another buyer for that, and then they can sell it. Yeah, and we now call it a liquid staking token. And the third problem was that Ethereum did not have this native ability that we talked about to delegate to a node operator. So you could find Ethereum did have one feature. It had separate validator key and withdrawal key. So the party who could withdraw the tokens could be different from the party who was using the coins with their validator on the beacon chain. But it wasn't trustless. Basically, you needed to find someone, sign a legal contract, needed to do kind of your own sourcing and so on. And there wasn't any way to just like select someone from a list of node operators or say, I want to withdraw my tokens now. And so you had these multiple problems, and I think it became pretty clear that there would be a new form, like that a protocol that would solve all of these problems would be quite dominant over anything that existed at the time, right? So when I look now where the kind of differentiation lines, let's call them that, are drawn, then you still have this, what we now call liquid staking versus non-liquid staking. So liquid staking is just when you receive a voucher that represents this ETH that is being staked by a node operator, and you can take it and you can use it somewhere. You can trade out of it. You can use it in Aave and Maker and so on. And the non-liquid ones are just if you give, for example, your money to an exchange, and they stake it for you, and they put rewards in your wallet every month. This is another very common form. I think Coinbase has like a double-digit market share using that model in staking right now, because it's very easy. So that's the other big category. Then I think custodial versus non-custodial is a pretty big one. I think there's a pretty big overlap, I would say, between like liquid and non-custodial, non-liquid and custodial, because they fit very well. And then finally, there's retail versus institutional. So it's more about which customer segments are you speaking to, right? So I think that Lido, the protocol, initially, I think its value proposition, it spoke particularly to kind of Ethereum native users, right, who wanted to self-custody because it was a non-custodial protocol, who wanted to use their coins in DeFi because it was liquid, right? And who weren't institutions, right? Because institutions weren't in DeFi at the time. So I think that's where Lido got its start. But we have over time also seen other protocols come around that focus more on, for example, ease of use. So I like the whole custodial liquid staking. Like its big benefit is that you just don't have to self-custody, right? So if I'm a user, most users in crypto never leave their centralized exchange account, right? They never withdraw a coin to Ethereum still. And so there's a huge number of users who you only reach if you have a custodial offering and you make it like one click from their existing exchange wallet. So it was very natural, I think, for Coinbase, for Kraken, for Binance, and these other platforms to roll out their own staking offerings in a custodial way. And I think I still remember that there was actually I had a huge concern personally that these exchanges would capture most of the stake by the time that withdrawals would even go live. Why? Because it's like custodial staking is so much simpler than non-custodial staking for users. But the main reason was kind of the liquidity, because if you're on an exchange, then you can very easily make staking liquid in the sense that you allow users to trade out of these staked validators. And I really expected exchanges to go very heavy on liquid staking because they could make it, they could allow people to trade out of it. They could allow, it to be used as collateral. And it didn't really happen that way, which kind of made me very, very surprised. So Binance had a staking derivative, Coinbase for the longest time didn't, Kraken didn't. I would still have to talk to an exchange executive and understand why they didn't do it. What was the exact concern? But it would have been, I expected them to do it, and I think it would have been the right play. And had they done it, then I don't know where we would be today, frankly, because it would have been such a compelling offering. I think that, it basically becomes a very big risk that eventually kind of 60, 70, 80% of Ethereum validators are run by like 2 to 3 large exchanges. So I think into that concern, then Lido was born to present basically a counterweight, like a non-custodial staking protocol that has some of the same benefits, which is it's very easy to use and it's liquid, so that people don't have to stake with exchanges.
I think that makes sense. And I think you kind of were pointing out 3 different user personas here. The first being, maybe an institutional user or somebody on an exchange that either wants the convenience of one click from an exchange, or they want, the compliance requirements of an institution. Then you have basically everybody in the middle that uses Lido, and then on the other end of the spectrum, you might have self stakers that mint Rocket Pool ETH, right? And how do you view the growth of those? I guess the first bucket and the third bucket relative to Lido's core users right now, and then how do you think about extending support for those types of users, from your seat in Lido?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think do you know where exactly they are in terms of market share right now, in terms of broad size, kind of the more institutional focused segment and the
CB ETH, which is interesting because it is retail only, has grown, I think, to roughly about 10% market share of liquid staking. I believe Rocket Pool is kind of around the same range. And CB ETH, it's notable that they've done this in the face of 2.5x the fee rate, right, that Lido charges. So definitely tells you something about the users there and their preferences. And I'm curious to know how you guys are thinking about positioning Lido also to capture some of that market. Maybe this is users that were previously staking with Kraken, right, traditionally, and now have withdrawn, or maybe they're users that were just waiting for withdrawals, right, to come off the sidelines. And I'm curious to just hear how you think about the growth prospects of either side of the market.
Yeah, so I think, if I'm totally honest, I don't strongly understand who uses CB ETH, because as you were saying, it's so much more expensive, but you still have to self-custody it if you want to use it, right? So I don't know, like, are all the assets on chain? Like,
I don't actually think you have to self-custody it. I think
okay.
you can mint it and then hold it in your Coinbase account.
Okay. So people just hold it as a stand-in for like regular Coinbase staking. So it was basically okay. So it's almost like they cannibalized their existing products in a way and just called it CB. Okay, that would make sense. Because if all of the CB was held on chain, then I would actually argue that Lido is already kind of a superset of that functionality. But if you have to custody it, then I would have to say, I think the way to access this market would be by offering alternative custodial products. By existing exchanges listing staked ETH, so people can buy staked ETH and hold it on an exchange or a wallet. I think that would be one, and the second would be through more traditional asset management channels. Right? So if I can hold staked ETH in my Fidelity account and my Vanguard account and so on, then that is probably a competitive channel kind of to these existing exchanges that speaks to a very similar, maybe even a little less sophisticated group of users. But that is, again, bigger than the previous. So yeah, that's what I would say about that. In terms of Rocket Pool, I think that solo stakers, so individuals who run their own nodes, and let's say who kind of run fewer than, 100 validators, I think that they are a really important backbone of Ethereum decentralization. And Rocket Pool, to their credit, has been around much longer than Lido as well. So they launched later than Lido. Lido was the first protocol to market by, I think, a decent margin. But the Rocket Pool as an idea and kind of the team behind it had been at work for a long time. And I think the reason that they were launching later was because they were set on a very specific model where users can basically, like solo node operators can divide their stake, and they can put 50% of their own stake, and they can borrow 50% of a user stake, and then they can stake that together, and they secure that in addition with a rocket pool token bond, or kind of a collateral, I think is a better term, right? And this has the benefit that it's actually trustless. It's at least more trustless. So there are some caveats that we don't have to go into, but it is definitely more trustless than other protocols that exist today. And so it's very important for Ethereum that these solo, it's almost like leveraging kind of this backbone in order to give them more stake, in a sense, right? This makes definitely Ethereum more decentralized.
Right.
And this is, the same values that Lido has as well. I think the two protocols had different priorities, if you will, right? Because Lido focused on this, or the Lido DAO focused on what they saw as a huge and possibly existential risk for Ethereum, which is a small number of exchanges capturing a majority of the Ethereum stake by the time the proof of stake would go live. And I think that was a very real and very big risk. And it is still a big risk today, even though many people don't want to talk about it. I was looking actually last year, and we will get into this, I think it was last year, when there was the self-limiting debate about Lido, and there was a lot of, Lido had a 1 month where there was very bad, like a series of very bad kind of consecutive press, where there was the Three Arrows kind of force selling their stack of stake ETH, and then Celsius, and there was Terra Luna, and at the same time there were kind of people on social media arguing Lido is getting too big and they should think about self-limiting, right? And at that time, Lido had almost no new inflow of stake, also because the stake ETH was trading at a discount. It was a bit cheaper than ETH, right? And so somebody who wanted to stake, they were just buying from the market instead of staking. And you could see that over 90% of people who were staking, people were still staking, but over 90% of it was going to Coinbase and Binance, into the custodial pockets, and it was a kind of, and these were entities that were not transparent at all, about how much share they have in staking and what is their infrastructure like, where is it located, and they don't care about client diversity or decentralization and so on. So I thought that was interesting. Anyway, I think the reason why why we got sidetracked to this. So Lido and Rocket Pool, I think, are ideologically very, very similar protocols that are starting from slightly different points. And I think they are moving towards the same point, which is in the case of Lido, there was recently a version 2 of Lido that included the idea of a staking router, which is a more modular architecture for adding basically different staking modules that represent kind of different lists of node operators, or different configurations of node operators. And what this allows is for Lido to not just distribute the stake to a permissioned list of node operators, but for anyone to write new modules and send them to the DAO to consider. And then the DAO approves, same way that MakerDAO or Aave, for example, approves a new form of collateral, then Lido DAO can approve a new staking module. And that can and will include things like permissionless staking that has a collateral attached to it, for example, or staking that is uses distributed validator technology, where, for example, professional node operators and individual node operators are working side by side, and have this kind of consensus protocol overlay and are working together to make blocks on the beacon chain. And so I think I would expect in the next year, Lido to move from currently, I think, 35 node operators to hundreds, if not thousands, of node operators as a result of this infrastructure. Wow. And what at the same time you're seeing Rocket Pool has long kind of hit the scaling limit of their approach, which is if you need all of the node operators to over collateralize any customer ETH that they take, both with their own ETH, but also with an additional, and I think it used to be something, I don't want to say something wrong, in the range of like 10% additional collateral in the form of the RPL token, then that is very expensive, and it doesn't scale. And so I think they hit the scaling limit, and what they are doing now is they are trying to reduce this collateral, and they are also whitelisting entities that is allowed to stake without a collateral. And so, such as Coinbase, by the way, which is interesting. And so I think that over the next year or two, I think you can expect these protocols to move more towards, look more and more alike in that sense. Yeah. So I think a Rocket Pool, it will have more permission node operators who are professional and who have a off-chain reputation at stake and so on. And that will allow them to meet more of the user demand. And Lido at the same time, it will have more ways also to support permissionless staking. And that is the group you were talking about, right? The solo operator who's really passionate, about running their own hardware, and who just wants to get a form of leverage basically on that, or the user who wants to stake, but they want to stake specifically with a solo operator and not with a professional node operator.
Because I want to dig deeply into this with you, Hasu, but before we do, I just want to bookend the conversation about market structure and maybe add one tiny bit of context there, and then ask you a specific question before we get into this, which is, to your I thought you made a really great point about at the height, it was May of last year, actually, when this debate started taking off, and Vasily made his post in the forum, and actually Vitalik, right? So it's not just, random people on Twitter. This was Vitalik himself proposing some sort of limit to Lido's growth. And the reason why, the sort of paradox that you pointed out was very interesting, that at the same time this debate was kicking off, it was actually Coinbase and Binance that were getting inflows. And originally, part of the reason why Lido was so supported was because, I think, like you, many were concerned that these centralized custodial-based offerings would take up an enormous amount of the stake, and Ethereum would lose some of its sovereignty, so to speak. But I think the reason why people are a little bit concerned about Lido today, and we can get into whether or not that's valid, is because of this perceived dynamic of a winner-take-all market for liquid staking, or staking in general. And I think I want to kind of just ask you the question directly about how you see this market structure evolving. Do you agree that it's a winner-take-all or winner-take-most market structure? And maybe if you could get into some of the dynamics that make this liquid staking in particular, what are some of the returns to scale? We talked a little bit about this offline, but if you could explicitly outline what those are, and then say whether or not you agree with that, and then we can kind of get into this self-limiting debate.
Yeah, so I would say I'm definitely in the camp who thinks that liquid staking, and by extension staking in general, has a very large network effect and return to scale. And so it's very likely, in my opinion, that the outcome will be very centralized. Or I think centralized is the wrong word, but it will be concentrated. Why is that the case? So first of all, I think liquid staking is a much, much superior solution to regular staking, because it's basically a superset of that, right? So you can have, liquid staking is like regular staking, but you also have liquidity, which is purely beneficial. And then it is, in addition to that, also non-custodial. And that allows it to be held in different ways, right? So a non-custodial asset you can hold in custody, but a custodial asset you cannot hold in self-custody, right? So in many ways, it's purely better in every dimension, right? Because you can turn a non-custodial asset into custodial one if you want. And for that reason, I think that the market share of liquid staking over regular staking will approach 100% over a long enough period of time. And so we only have to think about liquid staking. So liquid staking in general, I mean, what is so special about liquid staking? It is that you get this voucher that represents the ETH that is being staked, and you can use it. You get liquidity. And as we know, liquidity begets liquidity. And people want to use, or they get the most value out of using the staking token that has already the most acceptance, that they can use in the most places, such as lending markets, exchanges, that has the deepest liquidity and that has the highest brand recognition and so on, right? It is really like, to the degree that a token is used as money, it behaves like money. It has the same network effects as money, right? And so if we are talking about kind of a liquid staking protocol for a token that's not used as money, then these effects will be much lower, right? Because then if people hold it anyway and they don't use the liquidity effect, then it doesn't matter. But for a token like ETH that people use very actively, and many people treat it as a form of internet money, then the network effect is, as a result, very big. So that would be the first point. And one thing maybe to add, back last year, people were actually saying, look at stable coins as an example for why this network effect is not actually that big. And look what happened 1 year later. All of this, like Tether is exploding in size and all of the other stable coins are collapsing. I think this is a good example. I think why people shouldn't judge prematurely kind of what the outcome will be of a particular market. Because at the end of the day, network effect almost always wins. There can be path dependency and it can take a few years, but I think that when it comes to money, the network effect is just super strong, and in the end, it will succeed. So that's one, network effect. I think brand. I mean, we touched on this slightly. I think brand is just extremely important. I think as a user, most people are inclined to stake with what is already the largest provider and the oldest provider, by the way. And so if you're both, then that's a pretty big position, pretty good position to be in. Because staking is something that requires a lot of trust. You are basically putting your money into a box and you are leaving it there for years, if not decades. This requires basically a lot of trust in the operator, and that's exactly what a brand gives you, right? A brand is basically it reduces uncertainty about the future, and so that's very important. And then there's this idea that running or getting a when there's already some established kind of staking protocols, liquid staking protocols that have built these integrations and this liquidity. So there's almost like a minimum that you need to get to, a minimum size that you need to get to be even anywhere near, in the conversation. And so in the beginning, I think you can think about these in terms of fixed costs. So if you wanted to break into liquid staking today, you have to spend multiple billions of dollars, probably in that range, right? And so I think it is just very hard to spend that amount of money as a smaller protocol. And so the bigger you are, the less kind of the effect of the fixed costs is hurting the revenue. And There's one final thing that I would say. Actually, this is a thought that's kind of more new in my mind. I haven't really verbalized it before, but all of the criticism, not all of the criticism, but many of the criticism against Lido is completely correct. Like the concern that things can go wrong if most of the ETH would be in one protocol, and that protocol is not part of the Ethereum core protocol, and it has some governance layer, for example. And Lido is taking aggressive steps to decentralize the protocol and the governance. And one of them is this idea of dual governance, where Danny Ryan, and we will get to this, he has basically voiced the concern, yes, Lido is not one entity. It consists of many entities, but under extreme conditions, the incentives could play out in a way that these many entities behave as one entity, and then they do something that's bad for the users of Ethereum. So that is his concern, right? And what Lido can do or is doing about that is introducing the idea of dual governance, which basically says for anything that Lido wants to change, that Lido DAO wants to change about Lido the protocol by voting on it, the staked ETH holders can actually just veto the change.
Right.
And so you get this filter where bad changes can no longer pass through because they would not be in the interest of the staked ETH holders, right? And I think the bigger the protocol, the more staked ETH holders basically have to be convinced that a particular change is good for the protocol so that it can pass, right? And so you actually get this herd immunity from being in a bigger protocol where there's more people watching the governance and more people have to vote, have to kind of be in favor of any changes for these changes to come into effect. And so for me, this is definitely an argument for why I would use a protocol where there's more checks and balances, and kind of the bigger, the more people use it, the more people can spot anything that goes wrong.
It's a really good point, and I agree with you on all of that stuff. And the reason why I just wanted to interject that is I think many people agree with that point of view that it's a winner take all protocol. So people get a little bit worried about the amount of influence that a protocol like Lido has, because the general thinking is this protocol seems pretty unstoppable at this point. And just to get more specific, to go back, if we rewind the clock to May of last year, I kind of mentioned that it wasn't just some random pushback on Twitter. It was, it was originally kicked off by Superfizz, who openly wondered about the first staking provider to public commit themselves to not limiting their more than basically keeping their stake to lower than 22% of validators on chain. Vitalik retweeted that and said speculative take, we should legitimize price gouging by top stake pool providers. Like if a stake pool controls greater than 15%, it should be accepted and even expected for the pool to keep increasing its fee rate until it goes back down below 15%. That all led to an actual governance proposal in Lido that was initiated by Vitalik, one of the co-founders, basically voicing the idea, should we effectively self-limit? And eventually it was voted that they shouldn't do that. But I would love to get your perspective on the self-limiting debate anyway. It's kind of an interesting philosophical question, which is maybe a cousin of the should billionaires exist question, which is getting bandied around outside of our corners. But is it a good thing to be, from frankly just a capitalist encouraging entrepreneurs standpoint, is it a good thing to limit the growth of some of these protocols? And then maybe we can get into some of the specific ways that Lido is choosing to limit itself, what you were just alluding to, the staking router and dual governance.
A really good question. And I think last year it was a very pivotal time for the staking market in general and for Lido as well. So I think first of all, I have to say that many of the concerns that people like Superfizz and Danny and Vitalik have had and may still hold today about one staking protocol growing to a particular size, that these are definitely warranted. And so at for example, Lido, the Lido protocol, the smart contracts are still upgradable by governance, for example. And so governance could vote, for example, to change something about the smart contracts to the point that it would be detrimental for stakers or for node operators or for Ethereum itself. And so that is definitely a concern. There could also be bugs in one of these smart contracts that could have a negative effect. For example, ETH could be frozen. So I don't know how it would happen. I'm not, super technical, but I think that in general, when someone says, well, if there's a huge amount of TVL in one protocol and it's like doing one of the core functions of Ethereum, which is moving the beacon chain forward, then this could have a spillover effect on the security of the whole system. I think they are completely right. So that's the one perspective. The other perspective is, what do you think is the structural outcome of competition in the liquid staking market? And I am starting from the position that, size is dangerous and has responsibility in order to manage all the risks that come with it. But I'm also coming from the perspective that exchanges were and still are in the best position to capture a lot of stake and become very influential players in the staking market, and that the dynamics of liquid staking drive towards a winner-take-most outcome. And when you combine these things, then you kind of get into the mindset that you can't really, choose for there to be 10 staking protocols that all have 10%. I mean, you can dream about it, but it's not going to happen. And you have to be pragmatic. And what being pragmatic means is you try to make the best liquid staking protocol win. And you make that most, as decentralized and as aligned with the underlying base protocol as it can possibly be. And so I would say that is the summary of my position. I started from the point that I thought, this is the liquid staking industry. This is very clearly going to have one big winner. And there's nothing that can be done about this. You can tweet as much as you want. You won't change that outcome. I didn't even know all of the players involved. And I just thought, well, what can we do from here? Like, how can we salvage this situation? And I saw Lido as a protocol that was in a good position to fight the exchanges, and that I also saw as like culturally very aligned with Ethereum, having much of the same values and goals, and having a very clear commitment to transparency and to decentralization and to constant self-improvement. And I thought, yeah, this is something that I want to support with my time and, with my money as well. That was the position that I was in. And when the self-limiting debate came up, which, I thought, yeah, this is definitely going to be kind of a problem at some point. So it wasn't exactly a surprise. Then Lido has a grants committee that's called Lego. And so it has a budget, and people can give grants. And the way that Lido protocol works is there's the DAO, and the DAO basically decides the direction and the strategy of the protocol, right? And so it turns out that, whether Lido should self-limit or not is a pretty big part of what the strategy should be. And so it was very clear that this decision cannot be made without asking the DAO for their opinion. And so Vasily did what I think is exactly the right thing. So as a member of Lego, he looked for someone who can write what we call a Swiss booklet. Because in Switzerland, they have these ideas of the referendum, right? And people can vote. It's kind of a form of direct democracy, right? People can vote. And they publish these small booklets that basically say, if you believe in these things, then you should be in favor. And if you believe in like these things, then you should be in favor of the other option. And they are written by an independent committee, usually of experts on the topic. And they are basically a form of voter education and lowering the cost for them to come to a decision that would be good for everyone, right? And so there was someone in the Cosmos system who had in the past written such booklets for governance decisions in Cosmos, and I believe Vasily thought that this would be a great thing to also try in Lido, and then he reached out and he asked. Sasha is the name of the author of that post, and he agreed, and he didn't hold any LDO at the time. I don't know if he does now, but yeah, he wrote this unbiased analysis, and it had. I thought actually it almost reminded me of Vitalik's writing style, because Vitalik is like incredibly good at representing both views of an argument. Right? For example, when he wrote this post about the Bitcoin maximalist argument that he published on April 1st, and all of the maximalists were saying, this is an endorsement of Bitcoin maximalism. So it almost reminded me of that in a sense, because it really had, a full list of arguments for why you should be in favor of self-limiting and why you should be against self-limiting. And I could read this and say, yeah, this is like why we shouldn't self-limit. And somebody who was in favor can read this and say, yeah, this is exactly why we should self-limit, because exactly, like it isolates the assumptions that different people have and the different lenses through which they view reality that then lead them to, come to voting A or B at the end of the day, right? And so I thought that this was actually a pivotal moment for Lido governance, because it illustrates how the DAO should work, right? When there's a major decision, then, you should ask token holders for what to do, and you should try to make the decision for them as easy as possible. And so Lido token holders did end up voting against self-limiting, because I think at the end of the day, of course there's a self-interest, but also I think they were swayed more by the arguments against, because I think people working on Lido or investing in Lido, I think they are kind of, in a sense, agreeing with the idea that the staking market has these tendencies of being winner take most, and that it is very important for a decentralized protocol to win, and so on. And so that's why we saw, I think, the outcome that we did, and that is the track that the DAO has been on since then.
Yeah, I think that's a great overview, and it strikes me that I think a lot of folks on either side of the argument are actually very aligned at different stages. But a lot of this comes down to sequencing, right? And I think everybody was more or less aligned that Lido needed training wheels in the early days in order to create an offering that was competitive to the centralized exchanges, right? And I think everybody can somewhat agree, or most people can agree, that if there is a winner take all winner liquid staking protocol, then it should be more or less as hard to change as Ethereum itself, and the ability to stake with it should be as permissionless as staking with native staking, right? And I think the disagreement here really came down to like where Lido should be at its stage of growth, and it almost had, in the eyes of some folks in the Ethereum community, had already mitigated this risk of centralized exchange capture, but yet hadn't gone far enough to take off the training wheels, right? And I'm curious to just hear if you agree with that sort of overview, and also curious to hear where you think Lido is today, with things like, dual governance coming in, the staking router coming in, and early conversations about, ossifying parts of the protocol so that governance cannot upgrade them.
Yeah, I think this is a really good, I think, observation. I can't speak for everybody who's on the side of, Lido should self-limit, but I think a fair amount of people would say that if Lido had, was much even more decentralized than it is today, then they would feel comfortable with the higher market share, for example. Right. And so they can point to particular things and say, that's why I'm in favor of self-limiting today, but I may not be in the future. I was missing like a bit of nuance on that topic. I think also like it felt very tribal, which is never good, because then it felt more like I'm supporting like rival protocol X, and that's why I'm actually like making the stink against Lido. But anyway, so you're totally right. Like Lido in the past year had even more training wheels on than it does today. So in particular, I believe at the time, so I don't know when it happened, but I believe at the time, at least like part of the validators were still controlled by the original multi-sig committee. And that was simply for, because it wasn't like back when Lido started, it wasn't possible for a smart contract to control a validator on the beacon chain. And so you had to control it with an EOA. And the way that you did this was with a multi-sig. That was the only way to do it. And when it became possible, Lido switched to smart contract custody that was controlled, and the smart contract was controlled by Aragon governance. So when it was possible, then Lido switched. They rotated, all the EOA controlled keys, and then the multisig has been retired since then. So they have made further steps towards decentralization. However, the degree to which we call it like ossification, right? The degree to which this is possible is not just limited by the amount of, like how much Lido DAO wants to work on this, or like how much resources it can allocate, but it's also severely constrained by the underlying base layer. And so, for example, while the Ethereum, for example, withdrawals wasn't finalized from the beacon chain, it was actually impossible for Lido to make any ossifying steps in the protocol side. So I think these are definitely like these timing concerns. I think what I'm driving it is very, very nuanced. Like you need to unlock certain ossification on the layer below, so you can unlock ossification on the layer above, which is the staking layer. And at the same time, what you cannot control is the demand for staking that comes in, which is actually like unbound from this. And when you say that, for example, a decentralized protocol, and I use like decentralized now here as it's not where it wants to be, but it's way more decentralized than, let's say Coinbase and Binance. And you say, well, it can't grow above, let's say 20% because it doesn't have feature XYZ. And then you look at, the top two exchanges and they don't have any of the same constraint. It just doesn't make any sense. And so, yes, I think that decentralization is incredibly important. A lot of the roadmap that the Lido DAO has laid out for the future of the protocol is centered around decentralization. And it has been now for a long time. And that is because decentralization for many systems, it can be seen as a form of sacrifice, right? Like in Uniswap, for example, you sacrifice a lot by having to run your system on Ethereum in a smart contract, very inefficient kind of curve design. And like the cost of liquidity is very high. And if you could do, central limit order book, then you could support professional market makers and it would be way better, right? So something around these lines. Yeah, but in staking protocols, this does not apply. The thing that it does is very simple, and the more decentralized you can make it, the better it gets, because it's so much about neutrality and trust. And this is why for Lido, decentralization is not a sacrifice of anything. It's extremely good, and it's the number one priority in the sense that it's not a defensive move. Like decentralization for Lido is offense, if you will. So that's why it is the number one priority. And so I'm planning to post some suggestions over the next month, so that lays out some of my thinking and my role as strategic advisor for what the DAO should do. And that includes two things in particular. One is taking steps to decentralize the governance, very specific steps. So I personally see dual governance, shipping that. I see that as the number one priority, because that already de-risks so much about what can go wrong in governance. And the second thing is getting the staking router going. So basically increasing the node operator set. Because when you have a permissionless staking module and you have a DVT module and you can get the node operator set from 35 to 350, I think that also alleviates, I think, a lot of concerns. And it's not just that these two things will make an impact on their own. It's very similar to how in Ethereum, if you go back a few years, there was a general attitude, they will never ship proof of stake, they will never ship scaling, and so on, right? It's just like a project that just makes eternal promises and doesn't deliver anything. And with Lido, it's not at all like that, but I think there's always an element of the more of your roadmap you have already shipped, the higher the confidence and the momentum that the rest of the roadmap will be delivered as well. And I think this trust is just very important. And so, yeah, I think for that reason, I think that's where Lido stands right now in terms of the decentralization roadmap. And I think those are the things that the DAO should do next.
Yeah, that's a great overview, and I think so. Yeah, with the staking router and DVT, you're moving towards permissionless validator sets, right? With dual governance, you're basically have an interim solution to mitigate governance attack risks before these contracts can actually be made, immutable or ossified. I am curious to get your opinion on a hypothetical end state where this is the ideal end state, where the happy path for Lido, where it is winner take all market structure, and you have executed on this decentralization roadmap. Which functions will be left? Will be impossible for the DAO, not to ossify completely. And I think about whether it's how to distribute deposits across these different validator sets. I think about fees, as well as it's going to be a tough decision, to ossify a contract like withdrawals, where if you, maybe ossify too soon, you could have a catastrophic situation. And so I'm curious to hear in that end state, what will be left for the DAO to really control, and in particular, will there be pressure to ossify fees?
Yeah. So I think the question, what is going to be left, is a little similar in spirit to a question that I sometimes also hear, in order for, what should Ethereum do about liquid staking? And should they make an in protocol liquid staking solution? And if you squint, the two questions are actually the same, because we're also asking, well, how can Lido be ossified so much that it basically becomes a part of the Ethereum protocol? And you realize that there is actually, let's say Ethereum would put liquid staking into the protocol today, then there's two problems still remaining. One is the stake is not fungible. So every validator would create its own liquid staking token, and you don't have any of the liquidity aggregation effect that actually makes liquid staking so effective. And the second thing is, if you want to have the liquidity aggregation, then somebody needs to pick what node operators are receiving the stake. And if you want to be very simple about this, then you can say, well, just let the stakers decide. And then there's a list, and people sort it by the name that they trust or the amount of revenue that they can generate. Doing that, I think then basically what happens is the competition between node operators, it becomes concentrated in one, at most two dimensions. And that is actually extremely centralizing for the underlying node operator set. Because basically the stake goes to the parties that have the best brand. It goes to the parties that take the most risk, or it goes to the parties that have the lowest cost of capital, and or kind of where the stake is secured in like the safest jurisdiction, right? And proof of work is a good example. What happens if you let the kind of free market, quote unquote, for validation play out? Mining used to be entirely in China, because that's where the hardware makers were and the energy was the cheapest. And now it's almost entirely in the US, because all of the mining companies are now public, because that's what gives you the lowest cost of capital. So you would get basically a very similar outcome in staking if you just follow the incentives. And that is why actually I think one of the huge values that Lido has, or the DAO has for Ethereum today, is exerting some amount of governance over what a good node operator set should look like. So, for example, Lido has quotas for geographical decentralization, for what amount of stake is allowed to be on any particular continent, in any particular jurisdiction. How much is allowed to be controlled by one legal entity? How much is allowed to be run with a particular combination of different clients in order to drive client diversity? How much is allowed to be run in a cloud-hosted setup versus an on-premise setup? And different things like that. And so due to this governance over the node operator set, Ethereum today has actually a much, in many ways, better node operator set than it would have otherwise. And so I think what this answer kind of hints to is that some amount of governance over the node operator set will always be necessary, because you need to match the demand for delegating stake with the demand for staking, actually like running these validators. And you need to do this in a way that satisfies the objectives of the underlying network, which is Ethereum. And so at the very minimum, I think the DAO has to vote, and it can do this very infrequently, but it has to vote on the objective functions of the node operator set. And I think beyond that, you can, ossify almost everything, but I think this particular part will probably always require some amount of fine tuning. It can be infrequent, and it should have the full buy-in of the stakers. And so I think this is a realistic place for Lido to get to.
I want to just draw a line under the point that you made before about decentralization not antithetically to the product, but actually being offense. It's a core part of the value proposition of the product. And I would sort of draw a comparison in between Lido and Ethereum is very picky about what it takes into the actual protocol, right? It doesn't like to have an opinion about a lot of stuff, and it outsources actually very critical functionality of the protocol. Lido could be an example of that. Flashbots could actually be an example of that, right? Ethereum outsources its block building. And I think actually Eigenlayer or restaking protocols have the potential to be that as well. And I think it just bears repeating that I hadn't really made that connection until you just said what you said. But those are very interesting group of protocols that do very core functionality for Ethereum. And the example might be, Miles, just what we talked about in our first episode, but it could be something like utilities. It could be something like the banking system or health, things that are very close to the metal or the social contract or infrastructure of life. And what I want to make sure that we've at least got time to touch on a little bit is this idea of restaking. And I know you have a little bit mixed feelings on restaking. We're going to be talking to Sriram later in the season as well and sort of hear from the horse's mouth. But one of the ideas that I wanted to, because I've heard you talk about the principal agent problem, and that definitely plays when it comes to liquid staking in general. And I think you might add on an additional layer or potential risk of principal agent problem when it comes to restaking. So can you just give us the high level of how you think about the interaction or intersection in between restaking and liquid staking that we can poke at it a bit?
So restaking is the idea that Ethereum's validator set is an important asset or like a valuable asset in itself. And you can leverage the set to perform other activities by having these validators opt into additional slashing conditions. Rather, they opt into performing additional activities, and they can then be held accountable by opting also into additional slashing conditions. And so a few use cases for that have been put forward. I think they go from, you can run kind of protocol like like Ethereum validators also providing data availability, for example, also sequencing layer 2 rollups. They could provide oracles, bring prices on chain. I think these are just 3 examples of what you could do with this. I think it definitely has its place. In terms of narrative, it feels just a little overheated right now. And I think you can basically see this when Eigenlayer launched, the contracts filled up with stake right away, but there's no one on the other side who actually wants to use these services and would pay for it. And I think we're quite a bit away from actually seeing any revenue generating activities from this. And yeah, I think when it does, of course, it will become important. But I think, we will have to see. And on the other side of that, we talked about the competition between staking protocols. So definitely all staking protocols compete on providing rewards to the user. And you don't have to be the best one. Like, I think you can always boost your rewards by taking more risk, which is not desirable. So it's about, having a good ratio of risk and reward. But to the degree that that restaking will drive rewards to node operators, then the stakers will want to participate in these rewards. And a protocol that uses restaking, it will improve its differentiation in the staking market very clearly. So I can tell you, restaking is something that all of the staking protocols are definitely have on their radar, right? Today, there are 2 ways of doing it. I think one is Eigenlayer can, they can take what is already kind of a staking protocol, a staking token, and stake that, and then kind of use that, or the staking pool itself, they can run. They can implement Eigenlayer or another restaking protocol, right? And so I think this is another strategic questions that the DAOs behind these, or the operating companies behind these liquid staking protocols have to have to think about. In terms of timeline, if I have to, my personal timeline is it's probably between like 1 and 2 years away of becoming like a serious differentiator in the staking market. So that's why I'm personally more focused on executing the decentralization roadmap. I think that's more important today than anything that can boost the rewards for stakers.
So you had just laid out a really interesting relationship in between. There's sort of a co-opetition relationship between something like Lido and something like Eigenlayer, right? And I think a big question of that is who's ultimately upstream of whom and who has the relationship with the user. Is that roughly how you view it as well? Or maybe talk a little bit about that dynamic and if they have the potential to be more friendly and complementary, or if it ends up being a struggle to who has the user relationship.
I think that's a good way of thinking about it. I mean, today they are clearly very complementary, right?
Yes.
Because liquid staking protocols want higher rewards, and what a protocol like Eigenlayer wants is access to node operators and users, and this is what the liquid staking protocols have. So it's a perfect match in many ways, assuming that there's demand to use the liquid staking protocol. And that's, I think, that's where it hinges today. Yeah. So I think they've been incredibly successful at, bootstrapping the meme that there will be a lot of demand, but whether there will also be real demand to fill that expectation, I think that's to be seen. To the degree that they can, I think the relationship can be very complementary. I think it is possible that a restaking protocol will eventually also look into how can we integrate vertically and start running our own staking protocol, or a staking protocol might eventually say, well, why don't we internalize some of the restaking? But I'm not so constructive on these moves personally. And that's for a few reasons. I think one is that protocols in general, and this actually goes to what you said about fees, Miles, and I realize now that I didn't answer your question directly. Protocols, I think the thing about decentralized protocols is they can get much bigger than anyone thinks they do. And if you think you know how big they can get 10 times bigger. That's my perspective. And they will probably have very small margins. Yeah. So, and when you have a situation like that, you have a protocol that has very slim margins. There's very little to gain from internalizing that and vertically integrating. You're better off just collaborating, especially if it's in a market where kind of customization and you don't need to control the whole user experience. And I think like crypto is actually a pretty good example of that. You can have a pretty good user experience just from composing with other smart contracts. And the second thing is, it is related to the particular strategy that Lido DAO has or operates. And that is to become a neutral middleware, i.e. kind of a very, very thin protocol. Like actually like the things that Lido DAO should do should be minimized as much as possible. And so the protocol must have an incredibly small, what I would call management surface, so because that surface is what then the DAO ultimately has to manage, right? And that's why I, as an advisor of Lido, I'm very, very against any form of vertical integration. And when somebody says, shouldn't we do X, Y, I'm like, no, forget about it. Like, don't do vertical integration. It is not right for Lido. Like Lido should be as thin as possible and as neutral as possible. You don't want to manage anything. You don't want any complexity. And that's how you need to play in the staking market if you want to survive. And it's not even about winning, because if you don't win, then you don't survive. Like that is the nature of the staking market, because I don't think there's an equilibrium where you can have 20% market share or 30% market share, right?
Yeah.
This is why I'm like so against self-limiting, because if Lido doesn't keep growing, then it'll first stagnate and then it will die. And I think this is true for all liquid staking protocols. And so that's why I'm very pro collaboration and trustless interfaces between these protocols. And I'm very anti vertical integration. And that's why I'm also very pro, and now we finally get to the fee question. So I would be I don't think that one concern that people have about protocols that get very big, or companies that get very big, that they gain outsized bargaining power over their users, over their suppliers. And then what happens is they start increasing the prices.
Right.
Like Apple taking 30% fee from the App Store, which you can argue today, it's clearly okay for them to do it because, people can still not leave and get the same value elsewhere for cheaper. But I think one promise from decentralized protocols is that they cannot behave in this way, that the value that they can extract, that they can capture, is actually limited at a much smaller size. So I think definitely fees should be kept. I'm not even sure that they should be subject to management at all. I think Lido could have an internal fee market the same way that Ethereum has an internal fee market today. Ethereum is not opinionated about how much gas should cost on a given day, right? It only defines what is the supply of it, for example, right? That is allowed. And I think Lido will get to a similar point where the fee that the users pay and that the node operators receive is simply set by supply and demand.
Right.
And as long as the node operators adhere to the objective function that is very, very infrequently set by the DAO for what the node operator set should look like, then the price discovery between these two parties can be left to the free market, basically. And the DAO should have no ability to jack up the prices, and say, this is how much users should pay and this is how much node operators should receive. I don't think it should have that ability at all. Yeah. I think that the fee that they can get, that they can take, it should be small and it should be fixed. Yep. Because this is what gets both users and node operators and all of the protocols and integrations and so on that are building on top. It gives them all of the confidence that they need to treat this as really kind of long-term, reliable and immutable infrastructure.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense. And I think there's an obvious concern about, the demand side fees and, Lido's ability to rack those up to, Apple Store like rates once it has a monopoly. But I do think experimentation on the supply side, fee split between the protocol and its validators could actually be interesting to explore in making the protocol healthier. My gut sense is that the largest validators of the Lido set right now, the Chorus ones of the world, the P2Ps would actually take a smaller commission than 5% in order to receive larger deposits. But, as you're trying to bootstrap, say, these permissionless, validator sets via the staking router, they're going to need more than 5% potentially, or maybe, whatever that revenue that higher rake for the largest validators could be used to, bootstrap their collateral, right? And so I am thinking, from your strategy seat, how do you view because that's an example of maybe not being super thin, right? You can be very active, but towards a healthier outcome.
That's why I think a staking module should have the ability to set their own fees, basically, right? And then there can be competition between different modules. Right. So you're totally right. I think especially if you imagine from here that the price of Ethereum increases by 10x, it's not impossible, right? And then what is the margin of the average node operator? Is it 97% maybe? So the cost for them of actually running the hardware and the infrastructure is very small compared to the fee that they are then getting. And it's very clear that this is not, the market equilibrium, nor is it optimal for users or for Lido. And so I think in that case, it's very good for the protocol to have a price discovery on what is actually the cost of providing the service of running validators. And it can also work in the other direction, right? So if Lido goes, if ETH were to go again to like $100, then Lido must also be secure, right? And it can't all of a sudden be that node operators are not incentivized anymore to perform their services, because there's a fixed cost to running, to running these node operators. And maybe if ETH is 10%, then, the equilibrium for node operators on the beacon chain is actually like 2% of the network. Like, I don't know, it's possible. In either case, it should be possible that node operators also can increase their fees if their cost goes up or their revenue goes down. And another example of this would be like a bonded node operator who's permissionless and who puts up some of their own collateral but doesn't have a reputation, at least at first. They should say, I will participate in Lido, but someone needs to pay me for this cost of capital that I'm incurring, because otherwise I couldn't be competitive. This would not be profitable for me. And so they should, ask for a higher fee. And so I think it's very important for that reason, and I think it's part of the vision also for the staking router, that different modules can set their own fees, and then there's competition between modules, and there's price discovery on what the best supply side fee should be.
Hasu, unfortunately, we could keep talking that's the mark of a good conversation that we had about 5 topics we didn't even get to here. We could keep going on for forever here, but you've already been really generous with your time, and just really appreciate you having you back on Bell Curve here. So Hasu, this has been a ton of fun. You've given us a lot to think about and really teed up a lot of the questions that we wanted to ask for this entire season.
Yeah, hopefully not the last time. I'm really looking forward to what's the rest of the season. I think you have definitely a knack for topic selection. First, app chains, and then MEV, and then liquid staking. I think you're definitely at the frontier where it's most interesting.
Thanks, sir. I appreciate that. All right. Well, Miles and I will try to do the subject justice. And thanks again for your time. All right, Miles, what an episode there. So many great thoughts from Hasu. It's almost tough to digest and figure out where to start.
I know. I think we, covered a lot of what we covered on the first intro pod, but just a click deeper. And, really interesting to hear the perspective of somebody, sitting in his seat as the strategic advisor of the Lido DAO.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think one of my takeaways, the question of market structure was, in my opinion, answered about as directly as you're ever going to get it done. I think Hasu explained a lot of the ways, and he was thinking about some of the network effects and returns to scale of a liquid staking token issuer, similarly to how we were. So I thought the discussion started to get really interesting when we started to talk about, he thought about it exactly the same way that we did, which was he drew out these 2 sort of principles, frankly, of DAOs and decentralization that we talked about a couple of seasons ago. But it's kind of these 2 ideas, which is one, Lido sits in this very interesting camp of DAOs where it's very close to the base metal infrastructure of Ethereum. It's basically Ethereum deciding to outsource a core function of the Ethereum protocol itself. And so decentralization is, I love the way he phrased it, as being offense instead of defense. And then the other thing that is on the roadmap for Lido and sort of indicative of how they think about it is limiting the surface area of what the DAO does. I thought that was fascinating. So, and there are a couple of ways to go about this. Part of it is ossifying core parts of the protocol, but then it's sort of a mentality of limiting itself to whether that be operating on Ethereum or, not vertically integrating or whatever it is. It's just a very interesting perspective. I don't know what takeaways you had from that.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I think it's, we kind of wound back the clock to, before Lido existed. And just thinking from first principles, his conclusion was that there will be a winner take all of this market. And so the best thing we can be doing right now is making sure that whatever the winner is, as decentralized as possible, and the best version and the healthiest version of the network as possible. And, I think the sequencing of the decentralizing the protocol is very important, right? Because those training wheels were necessary to compete with the centralized exchanges. But, to your point now, decentralization is now a growth unlock for them, right? Whereas with more typical protocol DAOs that, are building more applications, user-facing applications, rather than something that could be considered infrastructure of Ethereum itself, right? That same sort of decentralization actually is a growth hindrance at times. And so now, it's at the stage of, okay, we have gotten the early lead. Now it's time to execute on the, decentralization roadmap as a growth unlock, right? What's going to get Lido from 30% market share to 70% market share? Well, it's going to be getting all the stakeholders of the network comfortable with their winner take all, market position. And to do that, you need to just basically start making the protocol as hard to change as Ethereum itself, but being very strategic in your decisions, and maybe even interim solutions like this, dual governance dynamic.
Yeah, we didn't get too deep into dual governance and Steth. Our next episode, we're going to be diving into the nitty gritty of how that all works. I did think one core idea to call out was, if I've always thought one of the most elegant parts of Ethereum's design is how it's tackled fee markets. I think the way that it works in Ethereum is a really elegant solution. You're starting to see Solana, where there was a fixed fee, potentially move more in the direction of fee markets. I had never really thought of the staking module for Lido introducing the possibility of a local liquid staking sort of fee market. I thought that was such an interesting takeaway, and that hadn't even occurred to me. So I thought that was a very cool point.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to hear that, the last part of the protocol that probably will always need some sort of DAO, involvement is the curation of these validator sets, and also, how deposits are distributed across them. I thought his point around, okay, well, what if you just let the stakers decide? Wouldn't that be the best possible way for the network? Well, problem with that is that it actually would end up with a less decentralized set, because stakers' natural incentive is to go with, the validators that they know are not going to lose their stake, right? And so, again, this curation is something that, Lido's been criticized for, but turning it on its head going forward, once there is permissionless sets, that curation is going to be necessary in order to actually bootstrap, deposits for those new permissionless sets.
Yeah, it was a super interesting point. It kind of got me thinking, Miles. I didn't want to ask. I never like asking about questions like what's the potential return, for something like this. But I'm increasingly starting to see this connection in between. Let me use a really high level, non-specific metaphor, but then try to get a little bit more concrete with it. Is these sort of levels of different corporations in America and the function they do and how critical it is to sort of human fabric and the social contract. So initially, utilities was the example that we used, but I think you could largely actually lump defense, you could lump banking services, you could lump healthcare, these things that you can't really just leave totally to the free market. There has to be some degree of regulation, and then the impact that has on returns of those various industries. And highly regulated industries, they tend to be more predictable. There's less upside because you couldn't, for instance, for the example that you used, you couldn't implement fee, surge pricing for heat, for instance. That would be an extremely unpopular thing to do. But it's because it's regulated, it's much more dependable and predictable. And Hasu, the way he described this primitive of Lido as a liquid staking provider, it almost takes it one step further. And you're isolating by limiting the surface area and making so much of this just ossified smart contracts. You are limiting the surface area. You're increasing the TAM, but you are decreasing probably the rake that you take there as well. So all in all, I think what this ends up looking like is kind of an annuity, something like an annuity, right? A very large total addressable market, winner take most with non-punitive fees So what you're left with is sort of this stream of income. And then I guess it just depends on how much that stream of income is bid up or down. But you could sort of look back at historical periods of time, even in the US. At various times, annuities have been in, they've been out. But that's kind of the framework that I'm starting to look at a lot of these protocols as. I'm curious what you think.
For me, it's still a we'll see. Because, as I was kind of alluding to, I think that, if you were to take a super active, role in trying to drive revenue to these protocols, you could actually do so in a way that you could increase the rake without, necessarily increasing the rake from the perspective of the user, right? So you could, right now, basically Lido fees are set at 10% for the user, and that 10% is split between, equally between the DAO and its validators. And I think there's some very interesting, kind of auction dynamics or market dynamics you could introduce to how that 10% is split up among validators in the DAO. And I think that, the protocol could actually increase its rake if it wanted to, by taking a higher cut and giving the largest validators a lower cut. And that, is more of a kind of a capitalist sort of approach here, right?
It is. But just not to interrupt, but I mean, how much can you really do that? It's 5% or something right now. You could move that you could move that a couple hundred basis points. There's no opportunity to go from a 30% to a 50% sort of gross margin. The point I was just trying to make is that there's the opportunity, to exert some influence, leverage on your supply side, and maybe you can increase your rake a couple hundred basis points. But there's no opportunity to the sort of flip side of not vertically integrating, not trying to reinvest those gains and trying to be a very small surface area, sort of flat, credibly neutral protocol, is you don't have any opportunity to go from a 30 to 50% gross margin kind of thing, or invest in all these new and exciting business lines. I think that's the flip side of that sort of point I was trying to illustrate.
I think that's fair. I do think that the returns could look a lot better than an annuity if we end up with these, this small margins, but in a winner take all, end market structure. I mean, that's going to be very, very valuable, right?
Yeah.
But I in general agree. I think it's definitely a very different, approach than a typical business, given, what dynamics are required to kind of, get that winner take all market share.
And actually, to that point, I think Hasu is absolutely right in just saying that everyone tends to understate the market size here. If I'm not 100% sold on the idea of Ethereum as money, but it might just be one of those things where reasoning by analogy is inherently imperfect. People use Ethereum for money-like things today. They probably will in the future. I increasingly think a helpful metaphor to understand the relationship between Ethereum and ETH, for instance, is dollars and stake dollars, which is bonds. And if you look at the global market size for US dollars versus US treasuries, it actually is about 1-to-1, and the market for treasuries is larger than the market for dollars, because there's more demand for yield bearing money compared to non-yield bearing money. So it's a very fair point. We are probably drastically underestimating how big this market's ultimately going to be.
Yeah. And, despite treasuries not being necessarily fungible, there's plenty of liquidity for those markets and ETFs. Maybe the only counterpoint there that I could make is that, ETH, right, is completely fungible, whereas a lot of US treasuries are not. And so maybe it's a stronger network effect there, and it's, maybe less than 1-to-1 and more swings in the way of the yield bearing asset. But I think you could be right as well.
You never know. It's tough to really gauge this stuff out. And then last thing, we sort of ended the talk talking about restaking. Hasu was not super bullish on that. I think his primary point there was just that there's not an enormous amount of demand on the demand side of a two-sided marketplace like EigenLayer. There's actually an enormous amount of people that want to restake their staked ETH, but there's not an enormous amount of node operators that want to run hardware for XYZ random chain. And for that reason, he wasn't super bullish on it. I did think it was interesting to call out the sort of co-opetition dynamic in between Lido and EigenLayer. And I do think it goes back to our original app chain thesis point of who has the relationship with the customer and who's upstream of who, because, it's kind of there's a natural push to vertically integrate there between those two providers.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think there's kind of two parts of the supply side for restaking. It's the stakers who's, especially liquid stakers who are not running hardware. Then there's, the validators that they've delegated their stake to. And I think the stakers would love this idea of additional yield. The validators are saying, well, actually, that marginal yield comes at a significant additional cost for me, whereas for the stakers, it's no additional cost, right? But what will be interesting to see is just how much, demand there is from these roll-ups, sequencer sets, oracles, bridges, and at what point, like, this is secure enough to get some of the larger players here and not just the ones that are looking for, a narrative to kind of latch on to, right?
It was interesting. I think we'll have to, the one thing, it's almost a philosophical answer, and I'm glad some of our responses were more tactically oriented in sort of history of liquid staking, but I think it's a question worth posing of, is it a good thing to limit like Ethereum? And I would at this point be more in the camp of, I think there are more creative solutions to implement than some sort of cap. I don't think it's a great message to send to entrepreneurs. There's actually a sort of a rich history of monopolies. Frankly, we could do a whole podcast on the histories of monopolies and antitrust and things like that. But starting with Rockefeller, probably even before, there's this rich history of entrepreneurs coming into an early stage, very wily, up and down sort of market and actually helping to tame it with the form of monopoly. And then there are sort of natural undermining effects that lead to more diversification later on. The John Rockefeller and what he did with Standard Oil is actually a really good example of that, where it was a boom bust industry that was impossible to make any returns in. He came in, standardized everything, and then the monopoly, sort of gave birth to one of the largest industries in the world. And there may be some, something that we could learn in crypto from doing that. So
I think so.
All right, Miles, this next episode is going to be really good. We've mentioned this a couple of times now, but we're actually going to be talking to Izzy from the Lido team, who's in charge of their node operations. So he's the perfect guy to be talking to about nitty-gritty questions around the staking module, dual governance, and how they think about decentralizing themselves. I think you all could tell today that that's an enormous part, not just of kind of a technicality of trying to align and seem decentralized. It's actually a core part of the value proposition for these liquid staking protocols, and it's how they go on offense. So I think that'll be a great conversation.
Yeah, really looking forward to it. And it was a blast chatting today.